Welcome to Story Tales. Please like this video and subscribe to Story Tales. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly as Coulter Maddox stepped off the military transport plane. After 8 grueling months in Afghanistan, the heat felt different here, less hostile, though no less intense. He adjusted the duffel bag on his shoulder, the weight of it nothing compared to what he'd carried overseas. His body still operated on military time, every movement efficient, purposeful, his eyes scanning his surroundings out of habit. Coulter hadn't told Leona he was coming home today. The last email he'd received from her was 3 days ago short, like all her recent messages had been. She told him the baby had arrived 2 weeks early. A boy. She hadn't sent pictures yet, blaming poor hospital Wi-Fi. It didn't matter now. He was going to see them both in person, that he navigated through the throng of fellow Marines reuniting with their families. Handshakes, tears, children being swung into the air, displays of emotion that Coulter observed with quiet detachment. He never had been one for public sentiment. That wasn't how his father had raised him, and 2 tours overseas had only reinforced that stoicism that a young couple brushed past him, wrapped in each other's arms, oblivious to everyone around them. Coulter looked away. He and Leona had been like that once, before the demands of his deployments had started to wear on her. Before her messages grew shorter, her video calls less frequent. He pushed the thought aside. They had a child now. Things would be different. The Houston air felt thick with humidity as Coulter flagged down a taxi outside the airport. The driver, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, glanced at Coulter's uniform. "Just get back?" he asked, pulling away from the curb. "Yes, sir," Coulter replied, keeping his answers brief as always. "Where to?" "Memorial Hermann Hospital." The driver's eyes met Coulter's in the rearview mirror. "Someone's sick. My wife just had our baby." The words felt strange in his mouth. "Our baby. Father." The concepts were still abstract, distant. Despite the months of preparation, the reality hadn't sunk in yet. "Congratulations," the driver said with genuine warmth. "Boy or girl?" "Boy." Coulter's mouth curved into what might have been a smile. He'd wanted a son, someone to teach, to shape, to raise differently than his own father had raised him. "First one, yes." "Nothing like it," the driver said, shaking his head. "Changes everything." Coulter nodded, turning to look out the window. The Houston skyline rose in the distance, familiar yet somehow changed, just as he had changed. 8 months wasn't a lifetime, but it felt that way. Wars had a habit of stretching time, making each day feel like a week, each week like a month. He thought about Leona, tried to picture her holding their child. There had been a time when he could conjure her image effortlessly, her dark hair, the small scar above her right eyebrow from a childhood fall, the way her mouth curved up slightly more on the left when she smiled. Now the image was fuzzy, incomplete. Distance did that. Coulter checked his phone again, no new messages. He'd texted her from the airport to let her know he was home, but had received no response. Probably sleeping, he reasoned. New mothers needed rest. The taxi slowed as they approached the hospital, a sprawling complex of modern architecture and reflective glass. Coulter paid the driver, adding a generous tip. "Good luck with the little one," the driver said, "and welcome home." Coulter nodded his thanks and stepped out into the heat once more, duffel bag in hand. The automatic doors of the hospital slid open, greeting him with a blast of cold air. The smell hit him immediately, antiseptic, clean, sterile. So different from the dirt and sweat and gunpowder that had been his constant companions for months. At the information desk, a nurse with tired eyes looked up from her computer. "I'm looking for Leona Maddox," Coulter said. "She had a baby recently. Should be in the maternity ward." The nurse typed something into her computer, then nodded. "Room 312. 3rd floor. Take a right out of the elevator." "Thank you." As Coulter walked toward the elevator, he felt a strange tension building in his chest. Anticipation, maybe, or something else. An instinct, the same one that had kept him alive in hostile territory, telling him something wasn't right. He dismissed it. This was a hospital in Houston, not a compound in Kandahar. The elevator doors closed silently behind him, and he pressed the button for the 3rd floor. As the elevator ascended, Coulter caught his reflection in the polished metal doors. His face looked weathered, older than his 32 years. His eyes held a watchfulness that never quite disappeared. Not even here. The doors opened, and he turned right as instructed. Room 312 was at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, soft light spilling out into the corridor. Coulter hesitated for just a moment, then pushed it open. The room was bright, sunlight streaming through vertical blinds. Leona was sitting up in bed, cradling a small bundle wrapped in a blue blanket. Her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, her face makeup-free and tired. She looked up as the door opened. For a split second, joy flashed across her features, then something else. Something that made Coulter's combat instincts fire all at once. Fear. "Coulter," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're home." He stepped into the room, setting his duffel down quietly. "Surprise," he said, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She didn't get up, didn't run to him as he'd imagined she might. Instead, she clutched the baby closer, as if protecting it. "I didn't know you were coming today," she said, her voice slightly higher than normal. "You should have told me." "Wanted to surprise you," Coulter replied, moving closer. "Let me see him." Leona hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough. Coulter felt that combat instinct again, the one that warned of danger before his conscious mind could process it. He reached the bed and looked down at the child in her arms. The baby was sleeping, tiny face peaceful, unaware of the storm brewing around him. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. The baby's skin was several shades darker than either his or Leona's. A rich, unmistakable brown that couldn't be explained away by lighting or jaundice or any of the rapid justifications that Coulter's mind desperately tried to construct. Time seemed to slow as the reality of what he was seeing sank in. The room fell silent except for the steady beep of the monitor beside Leona's bed. A nurse walked past in the hallway, her shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. Mundane sounds, normal sounds at odds with the seismic shift occurring in Coulter's world. "Who's the father?" he asked, his voice low, deceptively calm. The same voice he used when defusing situations that could turn deadly in an instant. Leona's eyes filled with tears. "Coulter, I can explain." "Who's the father?" he repeated, each word precise, measured. She opened her mouth, closed it again. The baby stirred, tiny fists waving in the air. "I made a mistake," she whispered. Coulter stared at her, his face expressionless, though something was breaking inside him. 8 months he'd been gone. 8 months of patrols and firefights, and watching men die. 8 months of holding on to the thought of her, of their child, as the one pure thing in a world gone to hell. "That's not an answer," he said. Before she could respond, the door opened again, and a doctor entered, clipboard in hand. He was young, with wire-rimmed glasses and an air of distracted efficiency. "Mrs. Maddox, how are we feeling today?" he asked, glancing up from his notes. He paused, noticing Coulter. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had a visitor." "I'm her husband," Coulter said flatly. The doctor's expression changed subtly, a flash of discomfort crossing his features. "I see. Well, I'm Dr. Reynolds. I've been overseeing your wife's care." Coulter nodded once, tersely. "I just need to check a few things," Dr. Reynolds continued, moving to the other side of the bed. He made some notes on his clipboard, then checked the monitor. "Everything looks good," he said, his tone deliberately cheerful. "Blood pressure is normal, and the baby's type O-negative blood means we shouldn't have any complications with the mild jaundice we were monitoring." Coulter went still. Type O-negative. Both he and Leona were type O positive. It was biologically impossible for their child to have O-negative blood. The doctor seemed to realize his mistake immediately. An awkward silence filled the room. "I'll come back later," he said quietly, backing toward the door. "Take your time." The door closed behind him, leaving Coulter and Leona alone with the truth that could no longer be denied or explained away. "Coulter," Leona began, her voice breaking. "Please." But he was already moving, picking up his duffel bag with mechanical precision. His mind had gone to a place it went during combat, detached, analytical, emotions locked down tight. "Coulter, don't leave," she pleaded. Let me explain. He turned to look at her, really look at her, and wondered if he'd ever known her at all. The woman he'd married 3 years ago. The woman he'd trusted with everything. There's nothing to explain, he said, his voice hollow. The doctor just did that for you. And without another word, he walked out, closing the door quietly behind him. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor hummed overhead as Coulter strode toward the elevator, his movements automatic, driven by the need to put distance between himself and the scene he'd just left. A nurse smiled at him as he passed. He didn't smile back. His mind was racing, piecing together the puzzle of the past year. The increasingly brief phone calls. The vague responses to his questions. The way she'd stopped sending photos of herself as her pregnancy progressed. All of it made sense now, in the worst possible way. Coulter, wait. Leona's voice echoed down the corridor behind him. He kept walking, his pace steady, deliberate. Please, just listen to me. He reached the elevator and jabbed the button, willing the doors to open immediately. They didn't. Leona caught up to him, her hospital gown fluttering around her legs, and 4-pole trailing behind her. Her face was streaked with tears, hair falling loose from her ponytail. You can't just walk out, she said, her voice pitched with desperation. We need to talk about this. The elevator doors slid open. Coulter stepped inside and turned to face her. There's nothing to talk about, he said, his voice betraying none of the turmoil inside him. Leona blocked the doors with her arm, preventing them from closing. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she said. You weren't supposed to find out this way. Coulter's control slipped, just for a moment. How was I supposed to find out, Leona? After raising another man's child for years? Or were you planning to keep lying to me forever? I was going to tell you, she insisted, tears streaming freely now. I just needed time to figure out how. A nurse approached, concern written on her face. Mrs. Maddox, you shouldn't be out of bed. You're still recovering from the delivery. Leona ignored her, keeping her focus on Coulter. Please, she whispered, come back to the room. We can work through this. The nurse looked between them, sensing the tension. Is everything okay here? No, Coulter said simply. It's not. He reached out and gently removed Leona's arm from the elevator door. Go back to your room, he told her, his voice softer now, but no less final. Take care of your son. The emphasis on the word, your, wasn't lost on Leona. She flinched as if he'd struck her. He needs a father, she said, a last desperate attempt. Then I suggest you find him, Coulter replied as the elevator doors began to close between them. The last thing he saw was Leona's face, crumpling in defeat as the nurse took her arm to lead her back to her room. The elevator descended smoothly, silent except for the gentle hum of machinery. Coulter stood rigidly, staring at the numbers as they counted down. 3, 2, 1. Lobby. When the doors opened, he stepped out into the bustling main floor of the hospital. People moved around him, visitors with flowers, patients in wheelchairs, staff in scrubs. Normal life continuing while his head just imploded. He made it outside before his composure began to crack. The Texas heat hit him like a wall, forcing him to take a deep breath. He stood there, duffel bag at his feet, unsure where to go next. Back to an empty house? A hotel? There was no plan for this scenario. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Leona. Please come back. I'm so sorry. Let me explain. Coulter stared at the message, a cold fury beginning to replace the initial shock. He started typing, deleted it, then tried again. Who is he? The reply came almost instantly. It doesn't matter. It meant nothing. Coulter laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. Meant nothing. 8 months he'd been gone, risking his life, and she betrayed him with someone who meant nothing. Another text from her. I was lonely. You were gone so much. Please understand. Understanding was the last thing on Coulter's mind. He pocketed the phone without responding and flagged down a taxi. Where to? The driver asked. Coulter gave him the address of the house he and Leona had bought together a year ago. The home where they were supposed to raise their family. The future they'd planned. As the taxi pulled away from the hospital, Coulter's phone rang. Leona again. He declined the call, then turned off his phone entirely. The silence that followed was a relief. The ride to the house passed in a blur. Coulter stared out the window, seeing nothing of the familiar Houston streets. His mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of his marriage, searching for signs he'd missed, warnings he'd ignored. They'd met at a friend's barbecue 4 years ago. Leona had been stunning not just physically, though she was beautiful with her dark hair and green eyes, but in the way she commanded attention. When she spoke, people listened. When she laughed, others laughed with her. Coulter, typically reserved, had been drawn to her immediately. Their courtship had been fast. Too fast, perhaps, looking back. 6 months after they met, he'd proposed. 3 months later, they were married. And then came his first deployment after their wedding 7 months in Iraq. She'd struggled with his absence, but had seemed to understand. It was his job, his duty. She'd known what she was getting into when she married a Marine, or so he'd thought. The taxi pulled up to a modest 2-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Coulter paid the driver and stood on the sidewalk, looking at what had once been his home. The flower beds Leona had planted last spring were overgrown now, untended. The American flag he'd hung from the porch before leaving was faded, whipping gently in the breeze. He walked up the path to the front door, each step feeling heavier than the last. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and he stepped inside, dropping his duffel bag in the entryway with a dull thud. The house smelled different, unfamiliar perfume mingled with the scent of takeout food and something else. Something male. Coulter moved through the rooms like a ghost, noting changes. New throw pillows on the couch. A jacket that wasn't his draped over a dining room chair. Wine glasses in the sink. Upstairs, the changes were more pronounced. The master bedroom, once meticulously kept, was cluttered with clothes and magazines. The bed was unmade, sheets tangled. On the nightstand, beside a half-empty glass of water, sat a man's watch, expensive, flashy. The kind of thing Coulter would never wear. In what was supposed to be the nursery, baby clothes were piled on a changing table, tags still attached. A crib stood in the corner, assembled but unused. A mobile of stars and planets hung above it, motionless in the still air. Back downstairs, Coulter opened the refrigerator. Beer he didn't recognize. Takeout containers from restaurants he and Leona had never visited together. Evidence of a life lived without him. His phone, when he turned it back on, was flooded with messages and missed calls from Leona. He scrolled through them without reading, then blocked her number. The action was calm, deliberate, final. Next, he called a locksmith. The man arrived within the hour, replacing all the locks with efficient professionalism. He didn't ask questions about the urgency, and Coulter offered no explanations. After the locksmith left, Coulter methodically gathered Leona's belongings. Clothes, jewelry, personal items all went into suitcases and boxes, which he stacked neatly in the garage. The man's possessions, the watch, the jacket, a razor in the bathroom, he threw in the trash. Night had fallen by the time he finished. Coulter sat at the kitchen table, a glass of whiskey untouched before him. The house was quiet now, purged of visible reminders of betrayal. But the knowledge remained a constant presence in his mind. His phone buzzed again, a different number this time. He recognized it as belonging to one of Leona's friends. He declined the call. Minutes later, the doorbell rang. Once, twice, then a persistent buzzing. Knocking followed. Then Leona's voice muffled through the door. "Coulter, I know you're in there. Open the door." He remained seated, unmoving. "Please just talk to me. Let me explain." The pounding grew more frantic. "My key doesn't work. Did you change the locks?" "Coulter, you can't do this." He took a sip of whiskey, feeling the burn as it went down. Outside, the noise continued for nearly an hour before finally subsiding. Silence fell once more. Later, long after midnight, his phone lit up with another text from an unknown number. Leona, using someone else's phone. It was Isaiah King. It meant nothing. "Please believe me. I love you." Coulter stared at the name. Isaiah King. The pieces fell into place immediately. Isaiah was a businessman Leona had introduced him to at a charity function last year. Wealthy, arrogant, always surrounded by beautiful women. The type of man who took what he wanted without consideration for who it belonged to. Coulter didn't reply to the message, but he saved it. Isaiah King. The name burned itself into his memory as he sat in the dark kitchen, planning his next move. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting strips of light across the kitchen floor. Coulter hadn't slept. He'd spent the night sitting at the table, his mind cycling through memories and plans, grief and rage. The whiskey bottle beside him was still nearly full. Getting drunk wouldn't solve anything. His phone rang again. Not Leona this time, but his younger sister, Avery. He answered on the second ring. "Coulter, are you okay? I've been trying to reach you since yesterday." Avery's voice was welcome after hours of silence. She'd always been direct, honest, qualities he valued more than ever now. "I'm home," he said simply. "I know that, idiot. Leona's been calling everyone. She says you won't talk to her." Coulter exhaled slowly. "Did she tell you why?" A pause. "No, just that you came to the hospital and then left. That you changed the locks." "What's going on, Coulter?" "The baby isn't mine." The words hung in the air between them. Saying it aloud made it more real somehow, more final. "What?" Avery's voice was sharp with disbelief. "You heard me. She cheated. The kid isn't mine." "That lying bitch," Avery whispered, anger replacing shock. "Are you sure? The baby is half black and has a blood type that's genetically impossible for Leona and me to produce." "So yeah, I'm sure." Another pause, longer this time. He could practically hear Avery processing this information, her analytical mind working through the implications. "Who's the father?" she finally asked. "Isaiah King. The rich guy with the car dealerships? The one from her charity committee. That's him." Avery cursed, a string of colorful words that would have made their mother wash her mouth out with soap. "What are you going to do?" It was the question Coulter had been asking himself all night. What was he going to do? The military had taught him to respond to attacks with precise, calculated counterstrikes, to neutralize threats efficiently, to protect what was his. But what was his now? Not Leona, not the child, maybe not even the life he'd thought he was coming home to. "I'm going to end it," he said finally. "The marriage. It's over." "Good," Avery said firmly. "She doesn't deserve you. Never did. I need you to do something for me. Anything. I need information on Isaiah King. Everything you can find. Business dealings, personal life, weaknesses." Avery worked in corporate intelligence. She knew how to dig up dirt, how to find pressure points. "Coulter," she said, her voice cautious now. "What are you planning?" "I'm planning to make sure they both understand what they've done," he replied, his tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. "I'm planning to make them regret it." "I'm in," Avery said without hesitation. "But you should call Marshall too. He'll want to help." Marshall Boone had been Coulter's best friend since their first tour together. A strategic thinker with a ruthless streak when it came to those who betrayed his trust. "I will," Coulter promised. "And Avery? Don't tell anyone else about this yet. Not until I'm ready. My lips are sealed. I'll come by later with food. You need to eat." After hanging up, Coulter finally moved from the kitchen table. His body felt stiff, unresponsive, as if he'd aged decades overnight. He showered mechanically, letting the hot water wash away the hospital smell that still clung to him. The face in the bathroom mirror looked like a stranger's, haggard, eyes hollow, jaw set in a hard line. Downstairs again, he called Marshall. "Maddox." Marshall answered, his voice instantly alert despite the early hour. "Heard you were back. How's the baby?" "Not mine," Coulter said bluntly. That 8 beat of silence. "Say again." "The baby isn't mine. Leona cheated." "Jesus Christ." Marshall breathed. "When did you find out?" "Yesterday. At the hospital." "Where are you now?" "Home. I'm coming over," Marshall said, no room for argument in his tone. "Give me 30 minutes. True to his word, Marshall arrived exactly half an hour later, letting himself in with the spare key Coulter had given him years ago. He carried a 6-pack of beer and a determination that radiated from him like heat. Marshall was taller than Coulter, with the kind of physical presence that filled a room. His time in the Marines had hardened him, but unlike Coulter, he wore his emotions openly. Right now, those emotions were anger and protectiveness, evident in every line of his body. "Tell me everything," he said, setting the beer on the counter and taking a seat across from Coulter. Coulter did, laying out the events of the previous day in precise, emotionless detail. Marshall listened without interrupting, his expression darkening with each new revelation. Isaiah King, he repeated when Coulter finished. The car dealer? Coulter nodded. I know him, Marshall said, surprising Coulter. Or know of him. My cousin worked at one of his dealerships. Guy's a piece of work. Treats his employees like dirt. Cheats his customers when he can get away with it. Did your cousin ever mention him being involved with married women? Marshall's mouth twisted in disgust. It was his thing, apparently. The challenge of it. Like some kind of sick game. Coulter absorbed this information, adding it to his mental file on Isaiah King. So what's the plan? Marshall asked, opening 2 beers and sliding one toward Coulter. Because I know you have one. You always do. First, I end the marriage. Clean break. No discussion. No second chances. Marshall nodded his approval. And then I make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of people Leona and Isaiah really are. Coulter took a swig of beer, his first taste of alcohol in 8 months. It was bitter, grounding. I want them to lose everything that matters to them, just like I have. Scorched earth, Marshall said, a grim smile spreading across his face. I like it. Count me in. The doorbell rang just as they were finishing their beers. Through the peephole, Coulter saw Leona standing on the porch, the baby in a carrier at her feet. She looked terrible, hair unwashed, clothes wrinkled, eyes red from crying. Good, a vindictive part of him thought. Let her suffer. It's her, he told Marshall, stepping away from the door. You going to answer? No. Marshall nodded, understanding perfectly. She'll give up eventually. But Leona was persistent. The doorbell rang again, followed by knocking, then pounding. Coulter, please. Her voice carried through the door. I know you're in there. Just talk to me. Coulter and Marshall sat in silence, waiting her out. I just came to get some of my things, she called. I don't have clothes for the baby. Please, Coulter. Be reasonable. Marshall raised an eyebrow at Coulter, who shook his head slightly. Not yet. Let her feel the consequences of her actions a little longer. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the noise stopped. Through the window, they watched as Leona picked up the baby carrier and walked slowly back to her car, shoulders slumped in defeat. She'll be back, Marshall said, cracking open another beer. I know, Coulter replied. And next time, she'll find all her stuff packed and waiting in the garage. Marshall raised his bottle in a mock toast. To new beginnings, he said, dark humor edging his voice. And to making cheaters pay. Coulter didn't drink to that. There was nothing to celebrate here, nothing to toast. Only a path forward through the wreckage of what had once been his life. Later that afternoon, Avery arrived as promised, bearing containers of homemade food and a determined expression that matched her brother's. She hugged Coulter fiercely, then assessed the kitchen with a critical eye. You two just sitting here drinking beer? Typical. She began unpacking the food: lasagna, salad bread. Eat something, Coulter. You look like hell. He complied, more to appease her than from any real hunger. The food tasted like nothing in his mouth. I did some digging on Isaiah King, Avery said as they ate. Preliminary stuff only, but it's interesting. She pulled out her tablet and brought up a series of documents: financial records, news articles, social media profiles. He's overextended, she explained, pointing to a spreadsheet. 3 dealerships, a bunch of investment properties, and a lifestyle he can barely afford. He's leveraged to the hilt. Marshall leaned forward, interest peaked. Vulnerable to financial pressure, then extremely, Avery confirmed. And there's more. He's got a reputation with women, lots of them, often several at once. But he keeps it quiet. His public image is important to him. Philanthropist, community leader, all that BS. So if that image were damaged, Coulter began, it would hurt him, Avery finished. A lot. The 3 of them spent the next few hours strategizing, identifying weak points, planning a campaign that would systematically dismantle the lives Leona and Isaiah had built. It wasn't about revenge, Coulter told himself. It was about justice, about consequences for actions. A.S. night fell again. Coulter's phone lit up with a text from another unknown number. Leona, still trying to reach him. He almost deleted it without reading, but something made him pause. It was a mistake, the message read. I need you. The baby needs you. Please don't throw away our marriage over one mistake. Coulter stared at the words, feeling a surge of anger so intense it nearly took his breath away. One mistake, as if betrayal could be reduced to a momentary lapse in judgment. As if trust, once broken, could be easily repaired, he finally replied, the first communication since he'd walked out of the hospital room. No, a mistake is forgetting to lock a door. This was a choice. He typed each word deliberately, then hit send before turning his phone off again. Avery and Marshall exchanged glances but said nothing. They understood. In their world, the world of people who lived by a code of loyalty and honor, some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Some betrayals could never be forgiven. That night, after Avery and Marshall had gone, Coulter stood in what should have been his son's nursery. The room was quiet, empty of a life that was supposed to fill it. He touched the mobile hanging above the crib, setting the planets and stars in gentle motion. For the first time since coming home, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd lost, not just Leona, but the future he believed in, the family he'd wanted, the father he'd planned to be. The grief came in waves, threatening to pull him under. But beneath it, steel formed. Resolve, determination. He would rebuild from this. He would emerge stronger. And those who had betrayed him would understand exactly what they had done. Outside, another car pulled up to the house. Leona again, no doubt, coming for another attempt to explain, to justify, to beg forgiveness. Coulter turned away from the window. There would be no forgiveness. Not now. Not ever. 3 days had passed since Coulter's return. 3 days of ignoring Leona's increasingly desperate attempts to contact him. 3 days of planning, of gathering information, of hardening his resolve. The living room had become their war room. Avery had brought over a whiteboard, now covered with names, connections, and potential pressure points. Marshall had contributed his tactical expertise, mapping out a strategy that would hit both Leona and Isaiah where it would hurt most. Coulter stood at the window, watching the street. Leona's car had been parked outside for hours, but she hadn't approached the house again. She was waiting him out, hoping he'd soften. She didn't understand who she was dealing with. The man who'd left for Afghanistan 8 months ago might have been willing to listen, to try to understand. That man was gone. She's still out there, Marshall observed, joining Coulter at the window. He handed him a cup of coffee, steam rising from the black liquid. Let her wait, Coulter replied, taking the cup. She's wasting her time. Avery looked up from her laptop, where she'd been compiling a dossier on Isaiah King. I've got something, she announced. Isaiah's hosting a charity gala tomorrow night. All the big names in Houston will be there. Coulter turned away from the window. Perfect, he said, his voice calm and measured. That's where we start. What exactly are you planning? Marshall asked, leaning against the wall. Coulter took a seat at the dining table, gesturing for the others to join him. We expose them, he said simply. First to those closest to them, then to everyone else. Leona's parents, Avery suggested. They've always been so proud of their perfect daughter. What would they say if they knew what she'd done? They'd be devastated, Coulter confirmed. They trusted me to take care of her. They believe in our marriage almost as much as I did. And they've got that whole church community, Marshall added. Very traditional, very judgmental of anything that rocks the boat. Coulter nodded. We start there. Then we move on to Isaiah's world. His wife, Avery said, pulling up a photo on her laptop. Melanie King, married 10 years, 3 kids, heavily involved in charity work. By all accounts, completely unaware of her husband's extracurricular activities. She deserves to know, Coulter said, studying the woman's face in the photo. She looked kind, trusting the way he must have looked to others before his world collapsed. What about Isaiah's business? Marshall asked. According to what Avery found, he's been skating on thin ice financially. One good push could send him over the edge. I've been looking into that, Avery replied, opening another file on her laptop. His dealerships make most of their money through creative financing packages. Some of them are borderline predatory. If the right regulatory bodies were tipped off, do what Coulter ordered. All of it. I want both of them to understand exactly what they've done. I want them to lose everything that matters to them, just like I have. Marshall grinned, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. This is going to be good. It's not about good, Coulter corrected him. It's about justice. Avery looked at her brother, concern briefly crossing her face. Are you sure about this, Coulter? Once we start, there's no going back. Coulter met her gaze steadily. Leona didn't think about going back when she was sleeping with Isaiah behind my back. She didn't think about consequences when she tried to pass off another man's child as mine. His voice remained level, emotionless. Why should I show them any mercy when they showed me none? Avery nodded slowly. You're right. They deserve everything that's coming to them. Let's get specific, Marshall said, pulling the whiteboard closer. What exactly do we do first? Coulter outlined his plan in detail, assigning tasks to each of them. Avery would handle the information gathering and digital aspects. Marshall would take care of the more direct confrontations. And Coulter would coordinate it all, keeping his eyes fixed on the ultimate goal complete and total retribution. As they discussed the details, Coulter's phone buzzed with another text from Leona. Still ignoring her, Avery asked. Yes, Coulter replied, not even looking at the message. She'll give up eventually, Marshall said. Coulter shook his head. No, she won't. Not until she gets what she wants. And what does she want? Avery asked. Forgiveness, Coulter said, the word bitter in his mouth. She wants me to tell her it's okay, that we can move past this. That's not going to happen. Good, Marshall said firmly. Some things can't be forgiven. Some people don't deserve forgiveness, Coulter corrected him. Leona made her choice. Now she gets to live with it. The doorbell rang, breaking the moment. All three of them tensed. It's probably her again, Avery said. Coulter approached the door cautiously and checked the peephole. It wasn't Leona, but her father, Richard Thompson, a tall man with graying hair and the same green eyes as his daughter. Coulter hesitated, then opened the door. That Richard's expression was a mixture of confusion and concern. Coulter, he said, I've been trying to reach you. Leona says you won't talk to her, that you've locked her out of the house. What's going on, son? The word son hit Coulter like a punch to the gut. Richard had always treated him like family, had welcomed him with open arms. Now Coulter would have to destroy his illusions about his daughter. You should come in, Coulter said, stepping aside to let the older man enter. Richard took in the scene the whiteboard, Avery and Marshall sitting at the table, the tense atmosphere. What's all this? He asked. We need to talk, Coulter replied, gesturing toward the living room. You might want to sit down. Richard remained standing. Just tell me what's happening. Leona's been staying with us. She's a mess. The baby's colicky. Helen is worried sick. The baby isn't mine, Coulter said bluntly. Richard stared at him, uncomprehending. What did you say? The baby isn't mine, Coulter repeated. Your daughter cheated on me while I was deployed. The child is someone else's. Richard's face paled. That can't be right. There must be some mistake. No mistake, Coulter said firmly. The baby has a blood type that's genetically impossible for Leona and me to produce. And in case that wasn't enough, one look at the child makes it obvious. He doesn't look anything like me. Richard sank into the nearest chair, the strength seeming to leave his legs. Who? He asked, his voice barely audible. Who is the father? Isaiah King. Recognition flickered in Richard's eyes. The car dealer? The one who donated to Helen's charity auction last year. Coulter nodded once, sharply. I don't understand, Richard said, looking stunned. Leona wouldn't. She's not that kind of person. Apparently she is, Avery interjected, unable to keep the anger from her voice. Richard looked at her, then at Marshall, as if just remembering they were there. I need to talk to Leona, he said, starting to rise. There has to be an explanation. Oh, I'm sure she'll have one, Marshall said sarcastically. Women like her always do. Richard's expression hardened. That's my daughter you're talking about. Your daughter who betrayed my brother. Avery shot back. Your daughter who tried to pass off another man's child as Coulter's. What kind of person does that? Enough, Coulter said, his voice cutting through the tension. Richard, I understand this is difficult to hear, but it's the truth. Leona confirmed it herself. Richard looked at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt or deception. Finding none, he seemed to deflate further. What are you going to do? He asked quietly. I'm divorcing her, Coulter replied. Beyond that, I think it's best if you don't know the details. Richard glanced at the whiteboard again, the names and connections becoming clearer now. "You're planning something," he said. "Some kind of revenge, justice." Coulter corrected him again. "Actions have consequences. Leona is about to learn that." Richard stood slowly. "I know my daughter made a terrible mistake," he began. "It wasn't a mistake," Coulter interrupted. "It was a choice. A series of choices. She chose to betray me. She chose to lie about the baby. She chose Isaiah King over her marriage vows. She's still my daughter," Richard said, a touch of defiance entering his voice. "And that baby is still my grandson, regardless of who the father is." "Then I suggest you focus on being there for them," Coulter replied, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. "Because I won't be." Richard looked at him for a long moment, as if seeing him for the first time. "You've changed, Coulter." "Yes," Coulter agreed, opening the door for him. "I have." After Richard left, a heavy silence fell over the room. Avery was the first to break it. "That was rough," she said quietly. Coulter shrugged. "It's only the beginning. Tomorrow, we start for real." Marshall raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "To justice," he said grimly. Coulter didn't join the toast. There was nothing to celebrate, only a path forward that would leave destruction in its wake. The morning of the charity gala, Coulter met with his lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Diana Reynolds who specialized in military divorces. She listened to his story without visible reaction, taking notes in precise handwriting. "Given the circumstances, we have a strong case for an at-fault divorce," she said when he finished. "Texas is a community property state, but the court will take infidelity into account, especially since the child is not yours." "I don't care about the money," Coulter told her. "I just want it over with quickly." Diana looked up from her notes. "That simplifies things. We can file immediately." "Have you spoken to your wife at all since discovering the infidelity?" "No. I've blocked her number. Changed the locks on the house." "Any contact at all?" "Emails, messages through friends. Her father came to see me yesterday. She's been sitting outside the house in her car, but I haven't spoken to her." Diana nodded, making another note. "That's good. Keep it that way. Any direct contact could complicate matters." She studied him for a moment. "Most clients in your situation are angry, emotional. You seem controlled." "I am angry," Coulter replied. "But losing control won't help anything." "No, it won't," Diana agreed. "I'll have the paperwork ready by this afternoon. We can serve her as early as tomorrow." After leaving the lawyer's office, Coulter met Avery and Marshall at a coffee shop downtown. Avery had her laptop open, busy with final preparations. "Everything's set," she reported as Coulter took a seat. "I've compiled all the evidence text between Leona and Isaiah, security camera footage of them together, medical records confirming the paternity. All ready to be distributed. And the guest list for tonight." Coulter asked. "Got it," Marshall confirmed, sliding a printed sheet across the table. "Isaiah's there, of course. His wife, too. Several of Leona's friends from her charity committee. Plus all the usual Houston social climbers." "Perfect," Coulter said, scanning the list. "And the press." "2 reporters confirmed," Avery replied. "Plus I've set up anonymous tips to go out to several more just as the event is starting. They'll be all over this by the time we're done." Coulter nodded, satisfied. "What about Leona's family?" "I sent the evidence to her parents an hour ago," Avery said, including a recording of Isaiah bragging about the affair to one of his friends at his country club. "Marshall's contact got it for us. He wasn't happy about being recorded," Marshall added with a grim smile. "But he was even less happy about what would happen if he didn't cooperate." "Any response from the Thompsons?" Coulter asked. Avery checked her phone. "Not yet, but they've seen it. The email was opened 20 minutes ago." Coulter's phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. He was about to ignore it when he noticed it was from Helen Thompson, Leona's mother. "Is it true?" the message read. "All of it." He replied simply, "Yes." The response came swiftly. "God help us all." Coulter put the phone away, feeling a momentary pang of sympathy for Helen and Richard. They were collateral damage in this war, innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. But he couldn't let that stop him. Not now. "What about Isaiah's wife?" he asked. Marshall checked his watch. "She should be receiving our package right about now. Express delivery," Signature required. What did you send her? Coulter asked. Everything, Avery replied. Photos, texts, paternity test results, plus a personal note explaining who you are and what her husband did. Good, Coulter said. She deserved to hear from us before it becomes public knowledge tonight. They spent the next hour finalizing the details for the evening. The plan was precise, calculated for maximum impact. Isaiah King would be exposed publicly, his reputation shattered beyond repair. Leona would be collateral damage, a fitting consequence for her actions, and as they were finishing their coffee, Coulter's phone rang again. A Houston area code, but not a number he recognized. He answered cautiously. Is this Coulter Maddox? A woman's voice asked, tight, with barely controlled emotion. Yes. Who's this? Melanie King. The name hung in the air between them. Isaiah's wife. Or at least I am for now. Coulter signaled to Avery and Marshall, putting the phone on speaker. Mrs. King, I assume you received our package. I did. Her voice was steadier now, cold with fury. I wanted to thank you for having the decency to tell me the truth. Unlike my husband, you deserve to know, Coulter replied simply. Yes, I did. There was a pause, the sound of a deep breath being taken. I also wanted you to know that I'm filing for divorce. Today. Isaiah doesn't know yet. He's too busy preparing for his precious gala tonight. I see. Will you be there? She asked. At the gala? No, Coulter answered. But the truth will be. A short, humorless laugh came through the speaker. Good. He deserves to be humiliated just as much as I've been. Another pause. I'm sorry for what happened to you, Mr. Maddox. No one deserves that kind of betrayal. No, Coulter agreed. They don't. Good luck, Melanie said, and the line went dead. Avery looked at Coulter, impressed. I didn't expect her to reach out. She's angry, Marshall observed. Rightfully so. That works in our favor. It does, Coulter agreed. Now, let's make sure everything else goes according to plan. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Coulter picked up the divorce paperwork from Diana's office. Avery finalized the digital aspects of their plan. Marshall handled the physical preparations, including arranging for the evidence to be displayed prominently at the gala venue. By evening, everything was in place. They gathered at Coulter's house to monitor the situation remotely. Avery had set up a series of alerts that would notify them when their various traps were sprung. The first alert came at 7:15 p.m. The charity gala was just getting started. It's happening, Avery announced, eyes fixed on her laptop screen. The first batch of photos just went live on social media, tagged with the gala's official hashtag. Marshall peered over her shoulder at the screen. Damn, those are explicit. They sent those to each other, Coulter said, voice flat. They knew the risks. The next alert came at 7:30 p.m. The reporters they'd tipped off had arrived at the gala and were asking pointed questions about Isaiah's relationship with Leona Thompson Maddox. At 7:45 p.m., Avery's phone rang. It was their contact inside the gala. You're not going to believe this, the woman said, her voice hushed but excited. Melanie King just showed up. She walked right up to Isaiah in the middle of his speech and slapped him across the face. Then she announced to everyone that he'd fathered a child with another woman while her husband was serving overseas. The place is in chaos. Perfect, Avery said, giving Coulter and Marshall a thumbs up. What about Leona? Is she there? No, but everyone's talking about her. Some of her committee friends are here, and they're horrified. One of them is crying in the bathroom. Apparently, she'd been covering for Leona, telling people her husband was okay with her seeing other men while he was deployed. Now she's terrified her own husband will find out she helped hide the affair. After the call ended, Avery looked at Coulter. It's working even better than we planned. Marshall nodded in agreement. The domino effect. One person's lie affects another and another. The whole house of cards comes tumbling down. Coulter said nothing, watching the chaos unfold through the steady stream of updates on Avery's computer. Photos and videos from the gala were spreading across social media. Isaiah King's face, shocked and red from his wife's slap. Guests whispering in groups, expressions scandalized. Reporters swarming like sharks that had scented blood in the water. His phone buzzed again. Leona, using yet another borrowed phone. What have you done? The message read. Everyone's talking about me. My friends are sending me screenshots. My parents won't even speak to me. For the first time in days, Coulter replied to her. Now you know how it feels, he wrote, to have your life destroyed by someone else's choices. Her response came quickly. I made a mistake. One mistake. You're ruining my entire life over one mistake. Coulter's jaw tightened as he typed his reply. It wasn't one mistake. It was hundreds of choices. Every time you met him, every lie you told me, every moment you let me believe that child was mine. You made your choices, Leona. Now you get to live with the consequences. He showed the exchange to Avery and Marshall, who both nodded in grim approval. She still doesn't get it, Avery said, disgusted. She still thinks she's the victim here. She will, Coulter promised. By the time we're done, everyone in Houston will know exactly what kind of person Leona Thompson is. And Isaiah King, too. The final phase of their plan kicked in at 9:30 p.m. The evidence they compiled about Isaiah's questionable business practices was sent anonymously to the Texas Attorney General's office, the Better Business Bureau, and several consumer protection agencies. Copies also went to Isaiah's business partners and the banks holding his loans. By midnight, the destruction was complete. Isaiah King's reputation lay in ruins. His personal life exposed. His business practices under investigation. His wife filing for divorce. His social standing, the thing he valued above all else, irreparably damaged. And Leona, collateral damage in the war she'd helped start, had lost everything as well. Her reputation, her social circle, her family's respect. The life she'd built on lies and betrayal had crumbled to dust. Coulter watched it all unfold with a cold satisfaction. It wasn't happiness. He wasn't sure he'd ever feel that again. But it was justice, real and complete. It's done, he said finally, as the last of their alerts chimed. They've both been exposed. Marshall raised his beer. To justice, served cold. This time, Coulter joined the toast. To consequences, he replied. May they be exactly what they deserve. 3 days after the gala, Coulter received word from his lawyer that Leona had been successfully served with divorce papers. Diana reported that Leona had looked shell-shocked, but had accepted the documents without argument. The process was officially underway. In those same 3 days, Isaiah King's life had continued to unravel. 2 of his dealerships had been raided by state investigators. His business partners were distancing themselves publicly. His country club membership had been quietly revoked. The press was having a field day with his downfall. Coulter monitored it all from a distance, neither participating directly nor intervening. The wheels he'd set in motion were turning precisely as planned. All that remained was to watch the final collapse. That opportunity came sooner than expected. Avery arrived at Coulter's house late in the afternoon, excitement evident in her rapid knock. You need to see this, she said as soon as he opened the door, thrusting her phone into his hands. That on the screen was a text from one of their informants, a security guard at Isaiah's luxury apartment building. The message was brief but clear. Leona Thompson just arrived with baby. Looks desperate. Heading up to King's apartment now. Is the building's security feed still accessible? Coulter asked, handing the phone back. Avery nodded, already pulling out her laptop. The guard gave me temporary access. We can watch what happens. They set up at the dining table, Marshall joining them minutes later. On the laptop screen, the security feed showed the hallway outside Isaiah's penthouse apartment. The high-definition camera captured every detail: the plush carpet, the tasteful lighting, the discreet service entrance where staff could come and go unobtrusively. There she is, Marshall pointed out as Leona appeared in the frame. She looked terrible. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore no makeup, and even through the security camera, the exhaustion was evident on her face. She carried the baby in a front carrier, a diaper bag slung over one shoulder. She's got nowhere else to go, Avery observed. Her parents kicked her out? Looks that way, Coulter replied, watching the screen intently. Leona hesitated outside Isaiah's door, visibly gathering herself before ringing the bell. Long seconds passed. She rang again, then knocked. Finally, the door opened. Isaiah King appeared in the doorway, dressed casually in expensive loungewear. His expression changed from annoyed to alarmed as he recognized Leona. The security feed had no audio, but they could read the body language clearly enough. Isaiah's stance was defensive, blocking the doorway. Leona was speaking rapidly, gesturing with one hand while the other supported the baby. "She's begging," Marshall said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Look at her. She really thought he'd take her in." Isaiah's response was visible in his body language, the step back, the hands raised as if to ward her off, the shake of his head. Rejection, clear and unequivocal. Leona became more animated, her free hand grabbing at his shirt. The baby, disturbed by the motion, began to cry, his tiny face screwing up in distress that was visible even on the security feed. Isaiah pulled away, his expression hardening. He glanced back into the apartment, then stepped aside slightly to reveal someone else in the room, a young woman, beautiful, watching the scene with evident discomfort. "The new girlfriend," Avery said. He didn't waste any time. Leona's reaction was immediate and visceral. Her body seemed to collapse inward, rejection written in every line. She said something else, one last desperate plead. Isaiah's response was to physically push her back, not violently, but firmly enough to make his message clear. Then he closed the door in her face, leaving Leona standing alone in the hallway, baby still crying against her chest. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, shoulders slumped in total defeat, she turned and walked back toward the elevator, one hand gently patting the baby in a futile attempt to soothe him. "That's it," Marshall said as Leona disappeared from the frame. "She's got nothing left now. No husband, no lover, no family, no friends, no reputation. She has the baby," Avery pointed out, "for whatever that's worth." Coulter said nothing, staring at the now empty hallway on the screen. He felt no joy in Leona's humiliation, no satisfaction in her pain. But he did feel a grim sense of completion. The circle was closing. Justice, of a sort, had been served. "Isaiah showed his true colors," he finally said, "just as we knew he would." Avery closed the laptop. "Men like him always do. They take what they want and discard people when they're no longer useful. And women like Leona learn the hard way who they can really trust," Marshall added. "Too bad she didn't figure that out before destroying her marriage." Coulter stood, needing to move, to process what he'd just witnessed. "The divorce hearing is set for next month," he said. "After that, it's over. I can move on." "What will you do?" Avery asked. "Stay in Houston?" "No," Coulter replied. "Too many memories here. I'm putting in for a transfer. Pendleton, maybe, or Quantico. Starting fresh." Marshall nodded. "Good plan." "Not fresh," Coulter corrected him. "Just different. There's no going back to who I was before." They were interrupted by a knock at the door. Cautious after weeks of unexpected visitors, Coulter checked the peephole first. What he saw surprised him. "It's Isaiah," he told the others, his voice low. "Alone." Marshall was instantly alert. "What the hell does he want?" "Let's find out," Coulter replied, opening the door. Isaiah King stood on the porch, looking far less polished than he had on the security feed an hour earlier. His expensive clothes were rumpled, his eyes bloodshot, his normally perfect hair disheveled. He looked like a man coming apart at the seams. "Maddox," he said, his voice hoarse. "We need to talk." Coulter didn't invite him in. "Say what you came to say." Isaiah glanced at the street behind him, as if checking that he hadn't been followed. "You've ruined me," he said bluntly. "My business, my marriage, my reputation all gone. Are you satisfied now?" "Not particularly," Coulter replied evenly. "Your actions ruined you, Isaiah. I just made sure people knew about them." "It was just sex," Isaiah protested, a hint of his old arrogance returning. "It didn't mean anything. She came on to me, you know. Told me you two had an arrangement while you were deployed." Behind Coulter, Avery made a disgusted noise. Coulter didn't react to the provocation. "Is that why you're here?" he asked. "To justify yourself? To explain why sleeping with another man's wife was acceptable?" "I'm here because I want you to call off your dogs," Isaiah said, voice rising. "The Attorney General's office is freezing my accounts. The banks are calling in my loans. I can't even access my own money. Again, your actions," Coulter pointed out, your predatory lending practices, your fraudulent finance packages, your embezzlement from your own company. None of that is my doing. They never would have investigated if you hadn't pointed them in that direction, Isaiah argued, growing more agitated. Do you know what this is doing to me? To my life? I have some idea, Coulter replied coldly. I felt something similar when I discovered the woman I loved had betrayed me with you. When I realized the child I'd been waiting to meet wasn't mine. When my entire future was destroyed in an instant. Isaiah ran a hand through his hair, desperation evident in every gesture. Look, I get it. You're angry. You have every right to be. But this has gone far enough. I'm begging you, call them off. I'll do anything. Anything, Coulter repeated, the word hanging between them. Yes. Name your price. Money, connections, whatever you want. Coulter studied the man before him, once so confident, so untouchable, now reduced to begging on his enemy's doorstep. It was pathetic, really, and deeply satisfying. I don't want your money, Coulter said. I don't want anything from you. What I want is for you to understand, completely and absolutely, that actions have consequences. That you can't take what isn't yours without eventually paying the price. I understand, Isaiah insisted. Believe me, I've learned my lesson. Just make it stop. Coulter shook his head slowly. No, Isaiah, you did this to yourself. Now you get to live with it, just like I have to live with what you and Leona did to me. Isaiah's desperation turned to anger in an instant. You self-righteous bastard, he spat. You think you're so much better than everyone else. So perfect, so honorable. You ruined my life. No, Isaiah, Coulter said, his voice deadly calm. You ruined my life. All I did was return the favor. He began to close the door, but Isaiah stuck his foot in the jamb, preventing it from shutting. This isn't over, he threatened. You'll regret this. I'll make sure of it. Marshall appeared beside Coulter, his imposing presence an unmistakable warning. Remove your foot, he said quietly, or I'll remove it for you. Isaiah hesitated, then slowly withdrew his foot. This isn't over, he repeated, backing away. Yes, it is, Coulter replied, and closed the door firmly in his face. Through the window, they watched as Isaiah stood there for a moment, fists clenched at his sides, before finally turning and walking back to his car, not the usual luxury sedan, but a more modest vehicle, probably borrowed. He's desperate, Avery observed. Dangerous. He's finished, Marshall countered. He just doesn't know it yet. Coulter moved away from the window. Either way, we've done what we set out to do. The rest is up to the legal system. Later that evening, as Avery and Marshall were preparing to leave, Coulter received one more text from Leona. I have nowhere to go, it read. Isaiah threw me out. My parents won't take me in. None of my friends will even talk to me. Please, Coulter. I need help. He showed the message to the others. Are you going to respond? Avery asked. Coulter thought about it for a long moment. No, he finally decided. She made her choices. Now she lives with them. Cold, Marshall commented, though his tone suggested approval rather than criticism. Not cold, Coulter corrected him. Just fair. She didn't think about me when she was betraying our marriage. Why should I think about her now? He deleted the message without replying. Another step in the process of cutting Leona out of his life completely. Soon, the divorce would be final. The legal ties severed. The past buried. But as he stood in the empty house after Avery and Marshall had gone, Coulter knew that some wounds never truly healed. They just became part of you, changing who you were, who you could become. The man who'd left for Afghanistan 8 months ago was gone forever. In his place stood someone harder, colder, more resolute, someone who understood, on a bone-deep level, that trust once broken could never be fully restored. That forgiveness was a luxury not everyone deserved. That justice, when it finally came, rarely brought the peace you thought it would. But it was enough. It had to be 2 months had passed since the charity gala that had destroyed Isaiah King's reputation, and, by extension, Leona's. 2 months of steady, inexorable fallout. The divorce proceedings were nearly complete, the final hearing scheduled for the following week. Coulter had already received orders for his transfer to Camp Pendleton. In 7 days, he would leave Houston behind, the city, the memories, And the woman who had betrayed him, he'd bought a small house near the base in California. Nothing fancy, but his own. No reminders of Leona. No nursery left half-finished. No life built on lies. A fresh start, or as close to one as he could manage. Coulter stood in his nearly empty living room, surrounded by boxes and a few pieces of furniture he'd decided to keep. Most of the house contents were going to charity or storage. He wanted to travel light, unburdened by physical reminders of his failed marriage. The doorbell rang, breaking the stillness of the morning. Coulter tensed, immediately wary. Few people knew he was moving. Even fewer had his new address. He approached the door cautiously and checked the peephole. Leona stood on his porch, looking nothing like the polished, confident woman he had married. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She carried the baby in a front carrier, his small head nestled against her chest. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her face had a gauntness that hadn't been there before. Coulter stood motionless, debating whether to open the door at all. His lawyer had advised against any direct contact with Leona before the final hearing. But curiosity won out. What could she possibly want now, after everything that had happened? He opened the door partway, not inviting her in. "Leona," he said, his voice neutral, betraying none of the complex emotions her presence stirred. "What are you doing here?" She flinched at his tone, so different from how he used to speak to her. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice smaller than he remembered. "Please, Coulter, just 5 minutes." He studied her for a moment, noting the desperation in her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted the baby's position. The child made a small sound, not quite a cry, but a protest at being disturbed. Against his better judgment, Coulter opened the door wider. 5 minutes, he agreed, stepping aside to let her enter. Leona walked into the house, her gaze taking in the boxes and general disarray. "You're moving," she said, stating the obvious. "Yes," Coulter replied, closing the door but remaining near it. "Transfer to Pendleton. I leave next week." "California," she said softly. "That's far." "That's the point." She turned to face him, visibly gathering her courage. "Coulter, I know you hate me right now." "I don't hate you," he interrupted, surprising himself with the truth of it. "Hate requires emotional investment. I don't have any left for you." The words hit her hard. She swallowed, blinking back tears. "I deserve that," she admitted. "I deserve all of it. What I did to you was unforgivable. At least we agree on something," Coulter said, crossing his arms. "Your 5 minutes are ticking, Leona. What do you want?" She adjusted the baby again, who was becoming restless. "I have nothing," she whispered. "Absolutely nothing. The apartment I was renting, they evicted me because I couldn't pay. My parents still won't speak to me. My friends have all abandoned me. I can't even find a job because everyone in Houston knows what I did. And this is my problem, how?" Coulter asked, his voice hard. "It's not," she admitted. "It's my problem. My consequences, like you said." She took a deep breath. "But I'm not here for me. I'm here for him." She looked down at the baby, who had begun to whimper softly. "He's not my responsibility," Coulter reminded her. "He's Isaiah's son. Isaiah won't even acknowledge him," Leona said, bitterness creeping into her voice. "He's blocked my number. His lawyer sent a letter saying he'll submit to a paternity test if ordered by the court, but otherwise wants nothing to do with either of us. Again, not my problem." Leona's eyes filled with tears. I know it's not. But Coulter, I have nowhere else to turn. No one else to ask for help. What exactly are you asking for?" Coulter asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Money," she admitted, the word clearly difficult to say. "Just enough to get a place to stay. To feed him. To start over somewhere." Coulter studied her, this woman he had once loved more than anything. The woman he had planned a future with, dreamed of raising children with. Now she stood before him, broken and desperate, asking for mercy he wasn't sure he possessed. "You have a remarkable talent for making poor decisions and expecting others to bail you out," he observed. "That's not fair," she protested weakly. "Isn't it? You chose to cheat on me. You chose Isaiah, a man well known for using women and discarding them. You chose to lie about the paternity of your child. And now that those choices have led you exactly where anyone could have predicted, you want me to fix it for you. Leona shifted the baby to her other arm, her movements betraying her exhaustion. I'm not asking you to fix anything, she said. I'm just asking for help. For him, not for me. Have you asked Isaiah for help? Of course I have, she replied, frustration giving her voice an edge. I've begged him. He doesn't care. And your parents? They won't help their own grandchild. They said they need time. Leona answered, her voice breaking. They're still processing everything. My father can barely look at me, and my mother cries every time she sees the baby. Coulter nodded slowly, processing this. So, I'm your last resort. Yes, she admitted. You are. The baby began to cry in earnest now, small fists waving in distress. Leona bounced him gently, murmuring softly, but he continued wailing. What's his name? Coulter asked suddenly. Leona looked up, surprised by the question. James, she said. James Richard Thompson. I didn't give him the king name. Or yours. Coulter watched as she tried to soothe the child, her movements practiced but weary. Despite everything, he felt a flicker of pity not for Leona, but for the innocent baby caught in the middle of a mess he had no part in creating. How much do you need? He asked finally. Hope flashed across Leona's face. 3,000 would get me into an apartment, she said quickly. Maybe a little more for groceries and baby supplies. Just until I can find a job. Coulter moved to the kitchen, where his checkbook lay on the counter beside a stack of moving documents. He wrote out a check, the sound of the pen scratching against paper almost lost beneath the baby's continued crying. When he returned to the living room, Leona was pacing slowly, rubbing the baby's back in an attempt to calm him. The gesture was so maternal, so at odds with the selfish woman he'd come to see her as, that it gave Coulter pause as he held out the check. 5,000, he said. That's all you get. Ever. After this, we're done. Completely and permanently. Leona stared at the check, then at him, disbelief written across her features. Thank you, she whispered, taking it with trembling fingers. Coulter, Don't. He cut her off. Don't thank me. Don't explain. Don't try to make this into something it's not. What is it then? She asked softly. It's a clean break, he said firmly. It's me paying you to never contact me again, to never show up at my door, to never call or text or email. As far as I'm concerned, after you walk out that door, you don't exist anymore. Leona flinched at the coldness in his voice, but she nodded slowly. I understand, she said, and I'll respect that. She tucked the check carefully in her pocket, then readjusted the still crying baby. I should go, she said, moving toward the door. Coulter opened it for her, maintaining a careful distance as she passed. She paused on the threshold, turning to look at him one last time. I loved you, she said quietly. It doesn't excuse what I did, but I need you to know that was real. Coulter's expression remained impassive. If that was love, he replied, then I'm better off without it. Leona's face crumpled slightly, but she said nothing more. She stepped out onto the porch, the baby's cries growing fainter as she walked down the path to the street. No car waited for her. She must have taken public transportation or walked. Coulter watched until she disappeared around the corner, then closed the door firmly. He leaned against it, exhaling slowly. Releasing a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, he pulled out his phone and called Avery. Hey, she answered, her voice warm. How's the packing going? It's going, he replied. Listen, Leona just left. She showed up asking for money. What? Avery's tone sharpened instantly. Tell me you didn't give her any. I did, Coulter admitted. 5,000. Coulter, after everything she did? Why would you? For the baby, he interrupted. Not for her. He's innocent in all this. Avery was silent for a moment. You're a better person than she deserves, she finally said. But I hope you made it clear this was a one-time thing. Crystal clear, Coulter assured her. It's over. Completely. After hanging up, Coulter returned to his packing, working methodically through the remaining rooms. The encounter with Leona had stirred emotions he thought he'd put to rest, not love or longing, but a complex mix of pity, anger, and a strange sense of finality. She had looked at him with a need that once would have moved him to do anything for her. Now it left him cold. Whatever they had shared was gone, burned away in the fire of her betrayal. All that remained were ashes, soon to be swept away as he started his new life. As he sealed the last box, Coulter felt lighter somehow. The encounter with Leona, difficult as it had been, had provided a kind of closure. He had seen her at her lowest, desperate and humbled, and had felt nothing, no satisfaction in her suffering, no desire to twist the knife further, but no forgiveness either. Just a calm certainty that he was finally, truly moving on. A week later, Coulter had finished loading the last of his possessions into the moving truck. His flight to California wasn't until the following morning, which left him one final night in Houston. He'd planned to spend it with Avery and Marshall, a quiet dinner to mark the end of this chapter of his life. But first, he had one last errand to run. He needed to fill his car with gas for the drive to the airport in the morning. It was a mundane task, unremarkable except for the strange symmetry it provided. His last act in the city where his life had fallen apart would be as ordinary as his first had been upon returning from Afghanistan. The gas station was on the outskirts of his neighborhood, a modern place with pay-at-the-pump service and a small convenience store. Coulter pulled up to an available pump, inserted his credit card, and began filling his tank. He was checking his phone when another car pulled into the pump opposite his. Something about the vehicle caught his attention. Once an expensive luxury sedan, it now showed signs of neglect. A dent marred one side, and the once gleaming paint was dulled with road grime. The driver's door opened, and Isaiah King stepped out. Coulter stiffened, watching as Isaiah walked around to the pump. He looked nothing like the confident, polished businessman Coulter had first met at a charity function 2 years ago. His clothes, while still expensive, hung loosely on his frame. His face was haggard, with several days' growth of beard shadowing his jaw. Dark circles underscored his eyes, giving him a haunted appearance. For a moment, Coulter thought about ignoring him, finishing his business, and driving away without acknowledgement. But something kept him rooted to the spot, watching as Isaiah inserted his credit card into the pump, only to have it rejected with a harsh beep. Isaiah tried again, with the same result. Cursing under his breath, he pulled out a different card and tried once more. Another rejection. With growing agitation, he tried a third card, then a fourth, each attempt more frustrated than the last. Finally, Isaiah slammed his hand against the pump and turned toward the convenience store, presumably to pay in cash. That's when he saw Coulter. The recognition was immediate. Isaiah froze, his expression cycling rapidly through surprise, fear, and finally a desperate kind of anger. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the narrow expanse of concrete that separated them. Coulter finished filling his tank and replaced the nozzle. He was about to get back in his car when Isaiah approached, his movements stiff with tension. "Maddox," he said, his voice rough with strain. "Didn't expect to see you here." "King," Coulter replied evenly. "Having some trouble?" Isaiah's jaw tightened. "You could say that," he admitted. "My accounts are still frozen. The investigators are going through everything with a fine-tooth comb." "That sounds inconvenient," Coulter observed. His tone neutral, that a bitter laugh escaped Isaiah. "Inconvenient? You have no idea. They've taken everything. My dealerships are in receivership. My house is in foreclosure. My wife got a restraining order against me. I'm sleeping on a friend's couch, and even he's getting tired of having me around." "Sounds like you're having a bad month," Coulter said, no sympathy in his voice. "A bad month?" Isaiah's control slipped. "You ruined my life. Everything I built, everything I worked for gone. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" "Actually," Coulter replied calmly, "I do. I felt at the moment I walked into that hospital room and saw another man's child in my wife's arms. I felt it when I realized that while I was risking my life overseas, you were destroying my marriage." Isaiah's anger deflated slightly, replaced by a flicker of shame quickly suppressed. "Look," he said, lowering his voice, "please, man, you ruined my life. I get that you wanted revenge, but it's done now. It's been months. Can't you call off the investigators? Tell them it was all a mistake." "It wasn't a mistake," Coulter pointed out. "Your business practices were illegal. The investigators found plenty of evidence to support that. I merely pointed them in the right direction. I'll lose everything, Isaiah insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. I'm already facing criminal charges. If they dig any deeper, I could go to prison. Again, Coulter said, unmoved, that sounds like a consequence of your actions, not mine. Isaiah took a step closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. What do you want? Money? I can still get money. I have connections. People who owe me favors. I don't want anything from you, Coulter replied. I'm leaving Houston. Tomorrow morning, I'll be on a plane to California to start a new life. One that doesn't include Leona, or you, or any of this. Then why not end it? Isaiah pleaded. Why not let me start over too? Coulter studied the man before him, once so confident, so untouchable, now reduced to begging in a gas station parking lot. It was pathetic, really, and yet there was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory. No, Isaiah, he said finally, I won't call off the investigators. I won't interfere in the legal process. What happens to you now is out of my hands. Please, man, you ruined my life. Isaiah tried one more time, his voice cracking. Coulter shook his head slowly. No, Isaiah, you did that all by yourself. He turned to get into his car, but Isaiah grabbed his arm. You can't just walk away, he said, anger flaring again. You did this to me. You have to fix it. Coulter looked pointedly at Isaiah's hand until he released his grip. I don't have to do anything, he said evenly. Your problems are your own, just like mine were mine when you were sleeping with my wife. This isn't fair, Isaiah protested. What I did with Leona was it wasn't personal. It was just sex. This what you've done to me, this is destroying my entire life. Actions have consequences, Coulter replied, opening his car door. You're just finally experiencing yours. Isaiah's face contorted with fury. You sanctimonious bastard, he spat. You think you're so much better than everyone else. So perfect, so righteous. You're nothing but a vindictive, petty. Goodbye, Isaiah. Coulter cut him off, getting into his car and closing the door. Through the window, he could still hear Isaiah's tirade, growing more desperate and incoherent as Coulter started the engine. In the rearview mirror, he watched as Isaiah stood in the gas station lot, hands clenched at his sides, mouth still moving in what appeared to be a string of curses and threats. Coulter drove away without looking back. The encounter, like the one with Leona, had provided its own kind of closure. He had seen his enemy brought low, not by his hand directly, but by the man's own actions and their inevitable consequences. There was a certain justice in that, a symmetry that felt right. As he drove to Avery's house for their farewell dinner, Coulter reflected on the past few months. The pain of Leona's betrayal had not disappeared. He doubted it ever would completely, but it had changed, transformed from a raw, bleeding wound into a scar that marked him but no longer defined him. He was not the same man who had stepped off that plane from Afghanistan, eager to meet his child and embrace his wife. That man was gone, replaced by someone harder, more cautious, less willing to trust, but also someone who knew his own strength, who understood that he could survive even the worst betrayal and emerge whole, if changed. Avery and Marshall were waiting on the porch when he arrived, bottles of beer already opened, and a grill sending fragrant smoke into the evening air. They greeted him with the easy camaraderie that had sustained him through the darkest days of the past months. Last night in Houston, Marshall said, handing Coulter a beer. How does it feel? Good, Coulter replied, and was somewhat surprised to find it was true. Like I can finally move forward. To new beginnings, Avery said, raising her bottle in a toast. And to leaving the past where it belongs, Coulter added. Behind us. They clinked bottles, a simple gesture that somehow felt profound. The sun was setting over Houston, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and reds. Tomorrow, Coulter would watch a different sunset from a different shore, the first of many in his new life. The California sun beat down on Coulter's shoulders as he stepped out onto the deck of his new home. The house was modest but comfortable, perched on a hillside with a view of the ocean in the distance. After 6 months at Camp Pendleton, he had settled into a routine that felt, if not exactly happy, then at least stable. Purposeful that he checked his watch. Avery and Marshall would be arriving soon. They were flying in for a long weekend, their first visit since he'd left Houston. He'd spent the morning preparing for their arrival, cleaning the already tidy house and stocking the refrigerator with their favorite beers. His phone buzzed with a text from Avery. Landed. Rental car acquired. ETA, 45 minutes. Marshall is already complaining about California drivers. Coulter smiled faintly as he texted back. Tell him to wait until he sees California prices. House is ready when you are. He set the phone down and leaned against the railing, taking in the view. The Pacific stretched out before him, vast and unchanging, a constant reminder of how small human concerns were in the grand scheme of things. His new assignment kept him busy, training new recruits and occasionally consulting on tactical operations. The work was demanding but fulfilling, allowing him to focus on something larger than himself and his past. The divorce had been finalized shortly after he left Houston. Diana, his lawyer, had handled the final details. Leona had not contested any of the terms, signing away any claim to their shared assets in exchange for the clean break both of them needed. He had heard, through Avery's occasional updates, that Leona had left Houston as well. She had moved to Oklahoma to live with a distant aunt, taking the baby with her. Isaiah King had indeed faced criminal charges for fraud and financial misconduct. Last Coulter had heard, he was awaiting trial, his bail posted by a business associate who still believed in his innocence, or at least in his ability to repay the favor. Those details, once so consuming, now felt distant, like a story he had read about someone else's life. They had lost their power to wound him, relegated to the past where they belonged. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke his reverie. He turned, surprised Avery had said they were still 45 minutes away. But the vehicle coming up the drive wasn't a rental car. It was a black SUV with government plates. Two men in suits emerged, their bearing unmistakably military despite their civilian clothes. Coulter straightened, instantly alert. Sergeant Maddox? The taller of the two called as they approached the house. Yes, Coulter confirmed, coming down from the deck to meet them. What can I do for you? The men exchanged glances. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Davis, the taller one said. This is Major Hoffman. We're with Special Operations Command. We'd like to speak with you about a potential assignment. Coulter raised an eyebrow. I'm not in Special Operations. We're aware, Davis replied. But your record in Afghanistan has come to our attention, particularly your actions during the Kandahar operation. Coulter's expression remained neutral, though the mention of Kandahar sent a familiar tension through his shoulders. That was a standard extraction mission, he said carefully. There is nothing standard about extracting a high-value intelligence asset under heavy fire with half your team incapacitated, Hoffman countered. Your tactical decisions saved lives that day. That's exactly the kind of thinking we're looking for. For what? Coulter asked. A specialized team, Davis explained. Highly classified, operating in sensitive regions where conventional forces can't go. The work is dangerous, but vital to national security. And why me? Your psychological evaluation following your divorce showed remarkable resilience and emotional stability under extreme personal stress, Hoffman said bluntly. Combined with your tactical abilities and combat experience, it makes you an ideal candidate. Coulter absorbed this information silently. They had been monitoring him, then evaluating him, even as he thought he was rebuilding his life in privacy. I'm not looking to be deployed again, he said finally. I found a good rhythm here. Davis nodded, as if he'd expected this response. We understand. The assignment would be based here in California. Minimal travel, maximum impact. The kind of work that makes a real difference. And my current responsibilities will be reassigned, Hoffman said. Your commanding officer has already been briefed on the possibility. He speaks very highly of you, by the way. Coulter considered the offer. 6 months ago, he might have rejected it outright, too focused on his personal vendetta to consider a new direction. But now, with that chapter closed, the prospect of a mission with real purpose held a certain appeal. I'd need more details before I could consider it, he said cautiously. Davis handed him a sealed envelope. Everything you need to know is in here. Review it, And if you're interested, the contact information is included. We need your decision within 48 hours. After the men left, Coulter stood in his driveway, the envelope heavy in his hand. A crossroads, unexpected, but perhaps not unwelcome. A new challenge, a new purpose beyond simply existing in the aftermath of betrayal. He was still pondering the offer when Avery and Marshall arrived an hour later. Their enthusiastic greetings and the flurry of activity that accompanied their arrival temporarily pushed the envelope and its contents from his mind. It wasn't until later that evening, as they sat on the deck watching the sunset, beers in hand, that Coulter mentioned the visit. Special operations, Marshall repeated, clearly impressed. That's top tier, man. The kind of work that really matters. It's definitely intriguing, Coulter admitted. But I'm not sure if I'm ready for that level of commitment again. Because of what happened with Leona. Avery asked gently. Coulter shook his head. No, that's done. I moved on from that. Have you? Marshall pressed, studying his friend's face in the fading light. Really? Coulter took a sip of his beer, considering the question. Yes, he said finally. I have. What happened with Leona and Isaiah, it changed me. I won't pretend it didn't. But it doesn't control me anymore. It doesn't define me. Avery smiled, a genuine expression of relief. I'm glad to hear that, she said. I've been worried about you, even from a distance. Worried that what they did would, I don't know, harden you too much. It did harden me, Coulter acknowledged. But maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. I see things more clearly now. I understand what matters and what doesn't. And what matters? Marshall asked, his tone uncharacteristically serious. Coulter gestured to the three of them. This, loyalty, truth, doing work that has meaning. He paused. The rest is just noise. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the last edge of the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deepening blue streaked with gold. So, Marshall said finally, the special operations offer. You gonna take it? Coulter looked out at the darkening ocean, feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in a long time. I think I might, he said. It feels like the right next step. To new beginnings, Avery said, raising her bottle in a toast that echoed the one they'd shared on his last night in Houston. And to justice served, Marshall added with a grin. Coulter raised his own bottle. To moving forward, he said, stronger, wiser, untouched by betrayal. As their bottles clinked together, Coulter felt a sense of completion. The cycle that had begun with Leona's betrayal and continued through his calculated revenge had finally ended. The wounds had scarred over. The lessons had been learned. The path forward lay open before him, unmarked by the past, but informed by it. He had survived the worst kind of betrayal and emerged not broken but tempered, like steel forged in fire. Harder, yes, but also more resilient, more capable, more aware of his own strength. Some people, he had learned, deserve forgiveness. Others deserve exactly what they get: the full and unmitigated consequences of their own actions. Leona and Isaiah had made their choices, and those choices had shaped their fates just as surely as Coulter's response had shaped his. Now, sitting with the two people who had stood by him through his darkest days, watching night fall over his new home on the edge of a vast ocean, Coulter felt something that had been absent for a very long time. Peace. Not happiness, exactly, that might come later, with time, but a quiet certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be, moving in exactly the right direction. The past no longer had power over him. The future, with all its possibilities, was his to shape. And this time, he would build it on a foundation of truth and loyalty, the only things he now knew that truly mattered. So, Marshall said, breaking the contemplative silence, "Any regrets?" Coulter thought about the question, turning it over in his mind like a stone worn smooth by water. Did he regret the path he had taken? The revenge he had enacted? The hardness that had come to define him? None, he said finally, his voice steady and certain. Some people deserve what they get. In the gathering darkness, his smile held a quiet confidence. The journey had been brutal, the lessons hard won. But he had emerged victorious in the only way that truly mattered, by refusing to be defined by betrayal, by choosing instead to become something stronger, something forged in fire and tempered by adversity, not untouched but unbroken, not unchanged but unbowed, moving forward, always forward, never looking back.